Okay. Hello and welcome to the Cambridge Zero Climate Change Festival panel event, which is on the topic of can leaders turn Paris ambition into Glasgow action at COP26. I'm Emily Shuckburgh and I'm the director of Cambridge Zero. This panel event is going to explore what needs to happen at the UN Climate Change Conference, COP26, for a successful outcome, with a focus on policy decisions, process, the role of leaders. And to join us in that discussion, we have four leading figures from Cambridge who've come together to discuss the chances of success. So let me first of all introduce you to our panel. So our first panelist is Sir David King. David is the founder and chair of the Centre for Climate Repair in the university based in Downing College. He was the UK government's chief scientific advisor from 2000 to 2007 and the Foreign Secretary's special representative on climate change from 2013 to 2017. He's travelled widely to persuade all countries to act on climate change and initiated an in-depth risk analysis approach to climate change, working in particular with the governments of China and India. And also initiated a very important collaborative programme, which is now known as Mission Innovation. As government chief scientific advisor, he raised the need for governments to act on climate change and was instrumental in the British £1 billion Energy Technologies Institute. In 2021, this year in June, he launched the Climate Crisis Advisory Group, a global team of 15 climate experts drawn from 10 countries who give monthly meetings on their work, which is available to all. So welcome, David. Our next panelist is Joanna Depledge. She's a fellow at the Cambridge Centre for Environment, Energy and Natural Resource Governance, Synergy. She's been following climate change negotiations and global environmental politics more broadly for more than 25 years as a staff member at the UN Climate Change Secretariat, a reporter for Earth Negotiations Bulletin, and an academic researcher affiliated with Cambridge University. Until the end of 2020, Joanna was editor of the international peer-reviewed journal Climate Policy and is now a member of its editorial board. Our next panelist is Natalie Jones. Natalie is a researcher at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk at Cambridge University. She works on global injustice and inequality and how that can potentially contribute to existential risk, with a particular interest in climate change, and her PhD work focused on accountability and procedural justice in global governance. Her background is in international law and climate policy, including as a staff writer for the Earth Negotiations Bulletin at the International Institute for Sustainable Development and as a research assistant at the Loudpack Centre for International Law, as well as as being a judge's clerk at the High Court of New Zealand. So welcome, Natalie. And our final panelist is Annela Anger-Kraavi, and she leads the Climate Change Policy Group at the Centre for Atmospheric Science in the Department of Chemistry at the university. She's the chief executive of the Cambridge Trust for New Thinking in Economics. She is directly involved in the COP26 negotiations as an EU negotiator and is co-chair of the UNFCCC Katowice Committee of Experts on the impacts of the implementation of resource measures. For over 15 years, she's been an active researcher in the area of climate change, economics and policy, and leads both projects as well as teaching. So welcome to Annela as well. So we're going to start off with just asking each of our panelists to provide some introductory thoughts and remarks around COP26 and the international climate negotiations. So I'm going to turn first to Sir David. So David, please.
Thank you very much, Emily. What I'm going to say is, first and foremost, that success at COP26, which is vital for our future, will depend heavily on a negotiating presence from USA, China, the EU and the UK, which is showing leadership from those four groupings. If we can get leadership from those four groupings, this would be a unique COP in the sense that so far we have not had leadership, especially from the United States. And that's what we've been missing over the past 25 years plus. I would like to see an agreement to reach the end of coal, oil, and gas in an orderly, efficient, rapid and fair way. That's absolutely critical in meeting the obligations countries took on in 2015 in Paris. And then I would like to see an agreement also to put a price on carbon emissions across markets, economies and geographies. That's a process that won't take place right across the world overnight, but it's a process that's got to be pushed forward beyond the smaller groupings of nations that are currently doing that. The funds committed in 2009, $100 billion a year from the wealthy countries to assist the less wealthy countries to make this progress, to make the transition an orderly one from the fossil fuel-based economy of the past to the green economies of the future. A realization of $100 billion a year must be developed at this COP26. I think I will stop at this point. I think the importance of COP26 can also be summarized by a full recognition of all countries that we're in a climate crisis now, and we really have to move quickly to avert a real challenge to the future of humanity.
Thank you very much, David. So full recognition that we're in a climate crisis. Joanna, I wonder what you're hoping COP26 will deliver in response to that.
Well, thank you very much, Emily. Firstly, let me say that I agree with every word that Sir David has just said. In my remarks, I'll take a slightly different tack, which is that in order to ensure that COP26 is a success from my point of view, we need to keep expectations realistic. Now, of course, COP26 is a really key moment for all the reasons that Sir David said, and especially for the UK. But to some extent, I think we have to avoid over-dramatising and overhyping it. And let me explain why I'm emphasising this point. It's not just because of COVID. It's not just because of the geopolitical context that we faced. It's partly because the formal agenda of the COP is relatively limited. It's a long agenda because of the backlog, but its scope is quite limited. There's no big treaty to be adopted. There's no big picture agreement there that needs to be reached. And I'm slightly worried that civil society in particular may perhaps overestimate what the COP can actually do. Now, secondly, and on a more positive note, a lot of the work has actually already been done. So the period since COP25 in Madrid has seen a whole raft of really significant policy announcements in other forums, in the UN General Assembly, at US President Biden's climate summit in April, and also the G7. So we have a net zero target by 2060 committed by China. We have now a net zero by 2050 target committed by the US, along with a massively increased financial contribution. So we have had a lot of these announcements have already actually been made. And I think this demonstrates another point that I'd like to make from the outset, which is that to some extent, the center of gravity of climate action has moved away to some extent from the formal UN negotiations under the COP. So when I started being involved in the COPs 25 years ago, it was very much the UNFCCC process that was at the center of global climate action. But now we've seen so many more actors becoming involved: businesses, cities, financial institutions, multilateral development banks, religious groups, individual leading countries. And in some ways, we don't need to wait for COP26 to be a success in order to take action. So don't get me wrong, I'm not downplaying the significance of COP26. It's a really important moment, but overall, we have to remember that whatever happens there, it's only one part of the policy and action puzzle. You know, there's been a lot of real work taking place in the run-up to COP26, and it will continue afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jo. So there's more to climate action than COP itself. Natalie, can I turn to you now, and maybe you can make some introductory remarks in terms of your hopes and aspirations for COP26.
Absolutely, thank you very much, Emily. And I again have to say I agree with absolutely everything that has just been said by Dave and Joanna. Also, I'd like to again take a slightly different tack and point out maybe a few specific opportunities. Because as Joanna said, of course, the prospects are actually limited in the formal negotiations, and there are agendas that limit what can happen. However, a couple of opportunities that exist. The first one of those is on ambition, and as we know, the NDCs, as they stand, the country's nationally determined contributions are not adding up to the kind of emissions reductions we need. In fact, we're going to see a 16% increase by 2030 rather than a 45% decrease as we need. And there is an item on the COP agenda which would allow countries a space to potentially look into how they can revise those NDCs faster, how they can bring larger contributions, and that is going to be really important if we are going to meet the 1.5 goal. The other thing is on finance, and Dave mentioned this. He mentioned the $100 billion goal, and what is going to be important as well is, because the timeline for that was originally 2020, and countries hadn't agreed actually like any more longer timescales. And so what is going to happen at this COP is an opportunity where countries can say, okay, like we can start a process, or like hopefully ideally we can agree on actually how we're going to bring even more finance, because like it was also quite clear 100 billion initially was only meant to be a starting point, and we actually need much higher volumes of finance there. So ambition and finance. Another thing I would hope to see is countries actually adopting the Paris Agreement rulebook in its entirety. We still have a few overhanging pieces which are, relatively important, like markets and non-market approaches, like transparency, how countries are going to report, about the common timeframes under which they're going to do these nationally determined contributions. And while those may be relatively minor and technical, they also have important implications for like how the Paris Agreement as a whole works. Although as Joe said, I would also stress that those are only like a small part of the international picture of what's going on. And finally, I'd like to just stress the importance of movements. And we heard from Joe about these like all kinds of non-state actors. And I think part of what I would hope and expect from COP is, huge mobilizations, huge numbers of people out on the streets and protesting in all kinds of venues. And I think we can absolutely expect to see a lot of pressure on these global leaders. Like Dave was saying, the EU, the UK and China and the US, we can absolutely expect and hope to see a lot of pressure being brought to bear by ordinary citizens against these leaders. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Natalie, not least for reminding us that the current pledges, welcome though they are, simply don't add up to the levels of reductions that are required to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees. Annela, can I turn to you finally for your comments?
Sure. And hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here. And first of all, everything I say here, it represents my own views and not the views of the oppositions of the institutions I represent. So my expectations for the COP are probably more practical in their nature. That doesn't mean that I don't agree with everything that has been said so far. But really what I hope from this COP is, first of all, when we meet again after 2 years and we have seen each other virtually, that we actually can work together the same way we used to work. Because negotiators are also people and the emotions involved. And I understand the high expectations, but just keeping in mind that we haven't been together for 2 years. Some people have changed and so on. It will take time a little bit to get used to that environment again. Also, there are COVID restrictions to rooms, So how we manage that. So hopefully we can manage that well. And so everyone who'd like to be can be in the room, or at least in an overflow room. So in terms of content, finishing the rule book, as Natalie mentioned already, would be the priority there. And that is the transparency, enhanced transparency framework and issues, matters related to Article 6. And perhaps not surprisingly, the COP in Glasgow is going to be, we can say, a science COP. There's a lot of emphasis on science. First of all, there'll be the IPCC 6 assessment reports, working group 1 contribution presented and discussed. So there will be science-related agenda items, such as the second periodic review, that will also consider IPCC input and regional inputs. So there will be also, we're starting the technical or data collection, well, information collection, data collection phase for the first global stocktake. So that's also science related. There'll be the systemic observation on an agenda, but there's Earth Information Day, so there's a lot on science in this COP, and science is one of the UK president's priorities. So I hope that everyone knows, all parties and observers can really learn from scientists and place their decisions on the best available science. I'll stop here. Thank you, Annela.
Well, thank you very much, Annela. So we're now going to move into some discussion amongst the panelists, but before we sort of dive into that discussion, I thought it would be useful probably for the audience. Some people will be very familiar with COP, and other people will be, will have heard the word COP, but not really know exactly what it is, apart from lots of people getting together in Glasgow to discuss climate-related things. So, I mean, Natalie, could you give us a very, very brief, bluffer's guide to what COP is?
Well, COP stands for Conference of the Parties, and these are the states who are parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change of 1992. So like if I was teaching international law right now, which I was just before we came to this, I would say, it's a meeting of countries. But of course, as we know, it's a lot more than that. We have all these actors who are not states who come as well. We have NGOs, we have businesses, we have local governments, youth and Indigenous peoples, and many more who come to try and influence what's going on, but also to have conversations among themselves, to hold events, to hold lectures, to share experiences and knowledge. So there's this part of it, which is like the formal negotiations, which are between the countries. And then there's also this whole wider sphere of, I guess, climate action. And
Joanna, I mean, this one is spoken of in terms of being somehow more important. It's COP26, but somehow it's more important than COP25. Can you just explain why it's perceived as being more important? I mean, you mentioned at the start that we need to be realistic about what can be achieved, but why is this one being picked out as being more important than some of the others?
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, as I said, COP26 doesn't actually have any particular landmark decisions on its agenda. There's no treaty that's scheduled for adoption. We won't have another Paris Agreement. That's clear. But I think its importance really lies in its timing. So Annela reminded us that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released its science report in August, which confirmed the severity of climate change, that climate change is already here with us now. And this has really underlined the urgency of the climate change challenge and the fact that we really don't have that long to go before 1.5 will be out of our reach. So that's very much puts emphasis on the timing on COP26 as a kind of a turning point to some extent. And then, of course, as Annela was also reminding us, there's a COVID pause, right? It's been 2 years since governments have met in this kind of context. So that makes COP26, I would say, unique in this way. And I think none of us really know how it's going to work out. I think in some ways, COVID could be that the COVID pause could be a positive thing, because it does provide an opportunity for kind of reset of the politics, the negotiations, because the last COP in Madrid in 2019, I think by all accounts, was not a great success. It was quite a fractious, bad-tempered COP. Perhaps COVID, the pause, provides an opportunity to reset that. On the other hand, there's all the logistics and procedural problems that are coming about. There's also then the fact that we've reached the point where governments are expected to update or table new NDCs under the Paris Agreement. There was a slightly loosely worded understanding that countries would submit updated and improved NDCs every 5 years. Because the COP didn't meet last year, that deadline is now this year in 2021. So all these new NDCs are supposed to be on the table. So far, there are still some quite big gaps among some countries. We still have no updated NDC from countries like India, the Russian Federation, Australia. No, we do from Australia, but it wasn't improved. Saudi Arabia, we're still waiting on those. So that timing, 5 years after Paris, is absolutely crucial. And then now as well, because of COVID, we've got this huge backlog of decisions that need to be taken. The Paris rulebook, again, that really, really needs to be completed. It should have been finalized in Katowice in 2018. It wasn't. The disagreements continued through to Madrid. So now it's really got to the stage where, you know, the clock is ticking. The Paris agreements, these final mechanisms, the market mechanisms, transparency, really need to be adopted and finalized now. So for all these reasons, COP26 is really coming at quite a crucial time. And I would just say, of course, now at COP26, we have this political window of opportunity, because unlike at COP25 in Madrid, we now actually have a supportive US president in the White House. And that opens up a whole new vista, I would say, of political opportunities that were completely closed off when his predecessor, obviously, as we know, not very keen on strong climate action, was in power. So this is a really positive, window of opportunity for Glasgow.
And David, I wonder whether, I mean, perhaps you want to comment on why you think this one is particularly different, but also, are you intending to go up to Glasgow, and are you planning on being part of any of the activities around the conference?
I expect to be in Glasgow, if I could just handle that one first. I'm very nervous about going, because I think it's going to potentially be a super spreader event of COVID-19, but I think it is a very important meeting. Can I just come back to talk a little bit about the importance of nationally determined contributions and even their origin? I was one of those pushing very, very hard to make this a nationally determined process instead of a top-down driven process where each country was told what it should be doing. The whole point of that, as we learnt in 2009, was that the United States couldn't possibly sign up to an agreement because Senate and Congress in the US has never agreed to an international agreement being imposed on the United States over climate change. And so we had to introduce this idea of voluntary commitments, nation by nation, towards the reduction of their emissions. And of course, until we got to Paris in 2015, although it was very clear that we were going to get an agreement, it was certainly clear to me, nevertheless, we didn't know when we added up all those voluntary contributions where we would be in relation to 1.5 degrees. And so we pushed for a review after 5 years, and for countries to then come forward over that period of time when we saw where we were with the total emissions in the world, so that we could get a review of those nationally determined contributions. And the idea, I think, in that negotiating hall was that we would come forward with a sum total of cuts that would be consistent with the 1.5 degrees target. So I do think this is plus 5 years, plus one because of COVID, since 2015. This makes it an especially important meeting. So I think that really is the most important point I wanted to make. Nationally determined contributions was a device to enable the US president to sign up because he wasn't being instructed by an international body to give that agreement. So I think this is critically important. Can I also just say that I think it's very important to understand, and I'm repeating now what Joanna said earlier on, that COP is not the only way forward. And if we look, for example, at the European Union introducing carbon cap and trade, this has now gone right across China. None of these things have been driven through by the COP agreements. What we're getting is national commitments being made by various governments who understand the risk and massive risk that we're all faced with. In Britain, in the period from 2000 to I would say till the present time, we decided we should take a leadership position because Britain itself, an island nation, is faced with massive challenges from rising sea levels. When there are storms at sea, there are storms inland. Our rivers are flooding at the same time as our coastline is under attack, and London sits bang in the middle of all of that. So we understand the nature of the attack. We got all-party agreement in 2008 on this process. Critical. We were the first, and still are, I believe, the first country in the world and the only country in the world to have this all-party agreement, which means that there is consistency from one government to the next. I would like to see other countries acknowledging that this is the way forward, taking individual national agreements, and then, of course, businesses, individuals. It's quite interesting to note, and I'll stop at this point, to note that in Britain, a recent publication indicates that meat consumption is down in this country by 17%. It's not where we hoped. We were aiming towards 30%, but this is what every individual is contributing towards. So we can tackle it at all these different levels. And to be honest, we have to tackle it at all those levels.
Annela, are you going to be, presumably you're going to be going up to Glasgow, are you? Do you want to say a little bit about what, give some insight into what you'll be doing when you're there?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Happy to do so. Yeah, I'll be going to Glasgow on the 28th of October and starting with KCI meeting. So KCI, as you said, is the Katowice Committee of Experts on the impacts of implementation of response measures. So that's the constitutive body under the convention that looks at the impacts of climate policies, and not just in terms of emissions, but also economic impacts on GDP, impacts on gender, inequalities. And we'll be having a 2 days meeting before the opening. So there's also corresponding agenda item to that constitutive body that is called response measures. So that will use the inputs from the KCI that are in the meeting report. We were also today just came from that meeting, hence I was late a little bit. We started the meeting already, so we'll continue it in Glasgow. So we're implementing our work plan activities. We were looking at just transition, economic diversification, and the second agenda item we having a second discussion is on facilitations of tools and methods for assessing the impacts of the response measures. So we'll be taking under the agenda item these outputs from the KCI's work as inputs and discuss those. Also, we'll be discussing how the response measures forum can provide input to the first global stocktake. So, and they'll be the EU negotiator, EU voice, representing 27 member states. Then I'm also one of the lead negotiators for matters related to IPCC in the EU. So all the IPCC related events, negotiations will be also for me to handle, including the second periodic review and the second part of the structured expert dialogue under the second periodic review. Then there will be also I'm a lead negotiator for an agenda item related to science that's called common metrics, that looks at the greenhouse gas metrics to convert other greenhouse gases, the CO2 equivalent, or other units, comparable units. And then I'm also responsible for science and IPCC in the cover decision 1 COP26. So that's each of the COPs has its covered decision, and that's one of the last things parties agree. So I'm also representing EU there. So it's quite a busy agenda. On top of that, a couple of side events. Of course, I have to spend time with my team and my government. So I think it's going to be very busy. Looking forward to seeing everyone again. As I said before, I have mixed feelings about being there in person and seeing people again. Hope it will be easy. I hope I won't cry, but I will probably. And yeah, I hope there will be success and that everything will go smoothly. We'll be very busy for everyone who will be there, of course, and we know there are high expectations, as I know as negotiator. That wasn't very brief, but that's briefly actually what I'm going to be doing there.
And I think what you said at the start of your initial comments, Annela, about negotiators are people and that emotions are involved is really important for understanding how these COPs work. Natalie, can I just turn to you? So I think you're going up to Glasgow as well. I wonder whether you could tell us a little bit about what you'll be doing there, but also maybe comment on this, this strange beast that COPs are, between the formal negotiations, but then everything that happens outside of the formal negotiations as well, and help people who are listening to understand how that all works.
Yeah, well, my role actually has quite an interplay with that. So what I'll be doing in Glasgow is, as Emily mentioned, I work for the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, and what we are is a reporting service, and we report on what happens each day in the negotiations. And this might make more sense if I describe how the negotiations work a little bit for people in the audience. So all of these kind of issues and items we've been talking about, like we've mentioned Article 6, which is the market and non-market mechanisms. We've mentioned the enhanced transparency framework. We've talked about the finance issues. We've talked about response measures, all of these items, and about, quite a number more as well. All of these have their own little group of negotiators who meet on them, and so there'll be representatives from each country, or like often not every country, but like a lot of the countries, and at least all the main groups will meet in a small room, and there will be a lot of these small rooms happening on different issues at once, right? And so like at any one time you might have 8 or 9 at least of these small rooms happening, and every now and again everyone will come into one big room, or hopefully with COVID, like a big room and then like an overflow room and maybe an extra overflow room, and talk about how all the issues are coming along as a whole, and compare the progress and say, oh, we're not making quite as much progress here as we would like, and like how is everything stacking up. But apart from that kind of stock taking, a lot of it happens in these individual rooms, and the issue with this is that a lot of countries don't have that many people there on their teams. Like if you have a large country like the United States, its delegation might be 100 people, but if you look at a lot of the least developed countries, for example, they might only have 2 or 3 at most, and that describes a lot of countries. And so one of the ways they get around that is by making blocks, like the least developed countries have a group of them where they do lots of coordination among themselves, and AOSIS, who are the Alliance of Small Island States, also have a block like that. But another thing that's really helpful is also like having a record of like what happened in all these different streams. And so our bulletin, basically what happens is we have like a person who sits in each of those rooms and takes notes and everything, and then at the end of the day writes up into a summary of like, okay, in the room on Article 6, here's what the main issues were, here's what the key countries said, and here are the like discussions or the disagreements that remain open. And so like everyone can read that, and actually it applies whether you're at the COP on the ground or whether you're outside. You know, like if you're in a capital, or if you're just like a member of civil society who's wanting to know what happened on that day, you can read it and say, okay, here's actually where the negotiations are up to. So it's all about increasing transparency in the process, and I think over time, because the Bulletin has been going for 28 or 9 years now, which is obviously longer than I personally have been involved, but I think over time it's come to be quite a trusted and quite an independent service, and lots of countries use it. So I feel really lucky to be part of such a I guess an organization with that kind of mission. But also just to speak to your question about like how these negotiations sort of intersect with, or what happens outside them. So at COPs, there are lots of people there who aren't part of the country delegations, as we've already mentioned. There are all the non-state actors who come, and they hold lots of events. Quite often they can attend lots of these small groups, but not always. The meetings might be closed, which again is where our services come in really importantly. And it's just a place where people can exchange knowledge, and they can campaign, and they can lobby, and there are a lot of actions and protests that happen inside the COPs as well as outside on the streets. And quite a lot of people have compared it with like a circus, and it can feel that way at times, but you have to also remember that there's a lot of just important local action, non-state action that is kind of formed and established in these like non-state spaces.
Joanna, thank you, Natalie. I mean, going back inside the formal negotiations, you stressed very much the need to be realistic about what can be achieved in Glasgow. But I wonder whether you could give us some insight into what, in best case scenario, what you hope could happen of a substantial nature, and also perhaps give us a bit of insight into the politics, into the geopolitics. Who are going to be the critical countries or leaders who are going to help unlock any substantial agreement?
Oh my goodness, Emily, I think they're all multi-million-dollar questions, right? If I knew all the answers to this, I'd be very rich indeed. I mean, in terms of the politics about it all, I think Dave summarized it incredibly well in his opening remarks, that it's what we really need is China, the EU, the US, with UK leadership brokering to come to some kind of agreement. I mean, we saw this in Paris, right? I mean, the reason why the Paris Agreement was adopted was principally because China and the US had hammered out an agreement amongst themselves beforehand. We're a far cry from that at the moment. I think one of the most worrying geopolitical challenges, to be honest, is the fact that relations are quite so strained between China and the West at the moment, and specifically between China and the UK presidency. I think that is a real obstacle, and it will be a difficult one to overcome. And I suspect that the EU and maybe Italy as co-host will have an important role to play there in bringing China more closely on board. I think, by the way, it's a bit of a red herring as to whether President Xi Jinping comes or not. I don't think he physically needs to be there. There's a lot of intrigue at the moment as to whether the Chinese premier will attend. I don't think that's necessarily important as and of itself. So we've dealt with the big emitters. I think, as I did say before, and I would recall the fact that we have President Biden and his envoy John Kerry will be there, and John Kerry does enjoy a good relationship with the Chinese chief climate negotiator. That could be a real positive inroad to success. But this brings me to all the other countries, because the fact is this is a negotiation amongst 197 countries, right? And China, the UK, EU, US are only a small handful among those. There are all the others, and historically, smaller countries have played a critically important role in raising the bar, in creating this kind of ambitious momentum We saw this in Paris with the High Ambition Coalition, which, yes, it included the US in the end, but it was principally formed by an alliance between the small island states, the least developed countries, the most vulnerable countries, and the EU. And if we could forge this kind of coalition of high ambition countries again, which will depend on a critical mass of support from the smaller countries, this could really be pivotal for having some strong outcome coming out of Paris. Now, what do I think that strong outcome could consist of? I think there's many things that could happen. If the Paris rulebook were agreed, that would be great. I think politically, I agree with what Dave said at the beginning. I'd like to see some kind of strong signal that coal is on the way out. So we've never managed to include the word coal in any kind of formal COP decision in the past for a whole range of political reasons. If we could have something about the phase out of coal in a formal COP decision this time round, that would be fantastic. Otherwise, I could envisage some kind of side declaration from a sizable group of front-runner countries that would send out a strong signal that coal is over. That will send a really, really strong message to investors, to the markets. That would really be a huge gain. And I'd like to see some kind of strengthened commitment on the global goals. For example, maybe pinning down the net zero date to 2050 and the global date for peaking emissions to 2025, because the Paris Agreement itself is really quite vague on both those things. It doesn't give specific dates. So pinning that down, a focused quantitative global goal like that would really cement this kind of pivot towards 1.5. But can I say just one thing? Most of all, what I really want to see, and I think I was really hearing this from Annela, is a smooth, constructive, friendly COP conducted in a broadly positive atmosphere, without political fireworks, without diplomatic incidents, without social unrest, and without a huge public health crisis. If the COP can come off smoothly, then that in itself will be a massive gain.
Thank you. I think everyone would agree with that. David, maybe I can turn back to you, because you did make put some comments in terms of those questions in your initial comments, but I wonder whether you wanted to briefly summarize what is it overarching you're hoping to come out of Glasgow, and who do you think are going to be the key individuals or countries that will facilitate that?
I fear I might repeat some of what Joanna's just said, but let me say it. I know both John Kerry, as he was the climate envoy, acting as climate envoy in the run-up to Paris, and also Xie Zhenhua, the Chinese negotiator. Critically important, when the Chinese president announced that he was taking Xie Zhenhua out of retirement on the day that John Kerry was announced as the climate negotiator for the United States by Biden. That was a statement by China saying, we want to work with the United States. Joanna's already referred to the extremely unfortunate terminology being used by several governments, but I think particularly ours, in criticizing China. We've just got to remember that China has put in place more in the way of renewable energy, nuclear energy, non-carbon-based energy systems than the rest of the world put together. China, since 2012, has been working extremely hard on this. So we can't point a finger at China and saying, you haven't done enough. They're doing an exceptional job. What we have to do is accept every country is working within constraints, and do not point fingers. We have to move forward on the basis of working together. Can I just say, in the run-up to COP21 in Paris, in 2 years, I made 96 official country visits. These were visits negotiating in bilaterals. Most of the advances are made in that way ahead of the COP meeting itself. And so I do know that Xie Zhenhua and John Kerry are heavily involved in bilaterals and trilaterals around the world at the moment, and that's a good sign. And John Kerry's statement yesterday is an indicator that he's feeling that things are moving in the right direction. I want to make one more different comment. COP15 is going on at the moment. This is a biodiversity COP. And I think this is highly relevant to COP26 on climate change, because frankly, as a world citizens, we have been ignoring what we're doing to our own ecosystems. I say our own because we depend on the ecosystems for our very existence. Our well-being depends on our managing the ecosystems well. And we have until now been ignoring them. Biodiversity is in a mess. We are really in a really bad state with biodiversity, and getting worse day on day. I'm afraid greenhouse gas emissions are increasing every year, even since that wonderful agreement in Paris in 2015. We've got to pick up our socks. We've really got to move, and move quickly, to deal with these problems. Time is no longer on our side. I do want to stress that every form of action is required in getting a successful COP, but after COP, we really have to work very quickly and very fast to achieve all of these key objectives that will safeguard the future of the planet for humanity.
Thank you, David. Annela, maybe I could turn to you now. So we've heard about various different groupings and coalitions of countries that come together. We've heard about bilateral and trilateral agreements that happen in advance of COP itself. Could you just give us a little bit of an insight? In particular, actually, how do smaller and less powerful countries actually have a say in amongst all of those different forms of discussions and negotiations? How do they make their influence felt in terms of the outcome? And we've been discussing a lot so far, the important issues of emissions reductions, NDCs, net zero, peaking emissions, and so forth. But of course, adaptation and resilience and climate finance are important aspects for many of those smaller and less powerful, less developed countries. I wonder whether you could just give us some insight into how their voice is heard.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's always not an easy question, as I think Joanna was saying, or Natalie was saying, that there are like the parallel sessions are limited, the number of parallel sessions limited. So these are the negotiations in smaller rooms. So there's 6 sessions in parallel because of some countries having not enough capacity to be in all rooms. To me, it's no more than 6. Actually, sometimes there's less. And so that the smaller countries can be in every room, or almost in every room. The other one is just having so many parties to the convention and to the Paris Agreement. It's difficult to organize negotiations as each of them spoke as a country. And as was already mentioned, that countries are organizing themselves as party groupings. So they it's not particular so that there's it can be regional, but usually it's not a regional group. It's more like parties with similar views. So there are some regional groupings, such as African group of negotiators, and so EOS is the Alliance of Small Island States who speak as, and ILAC is also another regional group, and that's Latin American countries. So that's one way of doing. EU speaks as also as one group. EU is not a country. So it's 27 of us, and we speak as one voice. So just that is one of the way that you inside the group, you have more chance to your voice to be heard than just being one of the, I don't know, maybe 150 parties in the room who takes the floor and then expresses their views. So that there's a lot of work in corridors. There's a lot of work going on already, as David mentioned, by bilateral, trilateral meetings at expert level and also at higher level, political level. A lot of work is done at the expert level ahead of the COP. So most of what happens there is just the tip of the iceberg. So that's for also to getting your voice heard. It's important that these things happen. So yeah, anything else I can think of, the smaller countries, yeah, they are like their worries, as I mentioned, the violence, loss and damage, and all issues around that, particularly for small island states that suffer a lot from climate impacts. Yeah, so they organize themselves as alliances and elect their own presidencies and leaders, and then speak as one voice. And that doesn't mean that sometimes also like countries speak separately. It's not always that we speak as only country groupings. The EU does. But when it comes to, for example, other groups, then that's not like G77, and China is the largest group. There's more than 100. I think it's 100, and it's not 77 members. There's more like 150s and 100. Yeah, there's many, not 150, 117 or something. Many countries part of that, and they also belong to other groups. There's an African group, the AOSIS, and so on. So they can speak, like as G77 China expressed one view, AOSIS comes another one, and there's a ways of getting your voice heard there. Yeah. Whether there's anything else, I'm just thinking whether there was, forgot what to say. Yeah. Yes, Annela.
Were you wanting to add something there, Joanna?
If you don't mind, I just wanted to add something to that really, really good in-depth overview that Annela has given us. I think we have to bear in mind that the UN climate change negotiations are actually remarkably democratic, open and inclusive. So they do operate on the basis of a one country, one voice system. So every country from the US to Tuvalu, they all have in principle equal weight. And obviously, geopolitical realities are different, but the process itself does try very, very hard to uphold the influence and participation of the smaller countries. So smaller countries do get financial help to attend the COP. That's very important. At least 2 delegates per country are paid for. And the decision-making procedure in the climate change negotiations is on the basis of consensus. Yeah, so what that means is that in principle, 1, 2 or 3 small countries can put their flags up and say that they don't agree with something. The final decisions are always taken in an open plenary, and every country has that opportunity to object. Yeah, and so even if you are a small country, you are treated democratically like an equal in the climate change negotiation. I think that is actually a very important forum. I know there's been a lot of frustrations with the climate change process, that it moves very slowly, that there's all these countries, there's a lot of obstruction. Yes, maybe, but that's because everybody has their say, and that it's so important that that process maintains its legitimacy and authority.
I was just gonna expand. Actually, I was gonna turn to Natalie first. I mean, the other key thing here, and actually perhaps one of the key differences that's happened over the last 6 years since Paris, has been the real rise globally of the youth voice, of the movement. I mean, Greta Thunberg in particular, but more generally, country by country, the youth rising up and making their voices heard around climate. That's obviously one important constituent of many others in terms of, outside of the country formal negotiations, the importance of everyone's voice being heard. I wonder whether you just want to comment briefly as to, how can somebody's voice be heard, an ordinary individual, global citizen of the world.
Yeah, well, yeah, as you mentioned, the youth are a really important constituency, and the UN actually has 9 of these observer constituencies, they're called, and youth are one of those. And this became the case in, I think, 2008 or 2009, and it's called Youngo, the Young Youth Association of NGOs, basically. And if you are a part of any organization worldwide of young people, you can become a member of it, and they have the rights to speak in these larger meetings, the ones I was talking about where everyone comes together in one room. The youth representatives can speak in those, and occasionally in the smaller groups, but it really depends on, you know, who is moderating and what the opinions are of the country representatives in that room and that kind of thing. So there is a mechanism where youth can have this voice in the process, although I will say it is rather limited in that sense. But in terms of the kind of youth involvement in this other aspect of the COP, this kind of wider space, definitely youth have a really strong and powerful voice. And of course, yeah, as you mentioned, Emily, the kind of role of youth movements has completely exploded in the last handful of years. But, you know, youth climate activism has a much longer history, and, you know, youth have been showing up in these spaces for quite a long time now. In fact, I mean, I even remember, well, I don't remember personally, but in 1992 at the Rare Earth Summit, you had Saverne Suzuki, who at the time I think was 12, and she gave an incredibly powerful speech. And so I think the role of youth have always kind of had a moral voice and a very important voice in these processes, and it's I think vitally important that they continue to have a well-recognized role. Oh, and the other thing I would just mention is that I know youth organizations are organizing what's called the Conference of Youth, or the COI, which takes place over the few days before COP. And that's open to absolutely anybody, I believe, who is in Glasgow, and they may even be doing a hybrid, although I'm not quite sure. So absolutely any young person can get involved in what's happening there.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time for this panel, but I think that it's the last hour has shown just how much of a complex process these COPs are, happening on so many different levels, that this year is going to be not only important, but also challenging. It's difficult circumstances, both for the world globally, but actually just for organizing in practical terms a large international conference in one location in the midst of an ongoing pandemic. But equally, this quite clearly is an absolutely critical moment for humanity. And so what happens in the discussions in Glasgow really does matter for the world. So just to finish things off, I'm going to ask each of the panelists just for a single word to characterize their thoughts, hopes or aspirations for COP26, and I'll do it in order of the initial comments. So David.
Critical.
Okay. Joanna.
Oh my goodness, this is awful, but I find one of Boris Johnson's slogans coming into my head, which is quite extraordinary. So I can't say I'm always in agreement with Boris Johnson on climate change, but this thought that get it done. So I hope you'll take that in the spirit in which it's intended, just get it done, both at COP26 and afterwards.
Okay, critical, get it done. Natalie.
Leadership,
and Annela.
Yeah, so before I wanted to say was that if something works on consensus, like then it works on minimum consensus. Hopefully, even if it's a minimum consensus, it will go smoothly without any incidents, major incidents.
Excellent. So critical, get it done, leadership, minimum consensus, and in particular, smoothly. Thank you very much to each of you for joining and sharing your insights today. And I think we all hope for a successful outcome in Glasgow in November. Thank you.